Hello, everybody. As we continue to make our way through a discussion of the early modern world, both early modern England and Europe, but also what was going on in the so-called New World, the Americas, in the early modern period, we're going to spend a little bit of time today talking briefly about um, one of the major contributors to the literature of the early modern period, particularly in America, and this is Anne Bradstreet. Anne Bradstreet is someone who, while her reputation had sort of waned a few centuries after her death, was really rediscovered in the 20th century, and was lifted up as an exemplar of the kind of work that was being done in the early modern period, not just by women poets, although um, the her work certainly is a strong example, a powerful example of the kind of work that a woman poet could produce during the early modern period. But her poetry is widely regarded in its own right, so that she's considered not just one of the great women poets of all time, but one of the great female poets, especially of the early modern period in America. So I want to talk briefly about her life and her career as a poet before then turning to just talking briefly about a couple of the poems that you read. So she was born Anne Dudley in 1612. So we're talking really the post-Elizabethan period around the time of the reign of King James. This period that you were reading about in your West in the World reading for this week. And like some other women of the early modern period, you can recall Sor Juana educating herself, right, reading the books that she found at hand when she was a child. For Sor Juana, that was the books she found on her grandfather's estate. Primarily, Anne Dudley was able to read in the library of the Earl of Lincoln, which was a nobleman that her father served. So, like some other figures we've read about, and grew up kind of in the realm of nobility, connected to the world of nobility. And so because of this leeway, this latitude she had to read in this library, she was able to have an education, again, a self-education, but it included classical works by Virgil, Plutarch, Ovid, as well as some more contemporary ones from the Elizabethan period and ultimately someone like Milton. So she read widely and deeply, not just as a child, but also as an adult. In 1628, she married Simon Bradstreet, and then in 1630, so while she was still essentially a newlywed, she and her new husband and her parents all immigrated to America. And they were part of this wave of Puritans. You learned a little bit about the Puritans from Dr. Blackburn's lecture and also from your reading. And there were a number of Puritans who came to New England at this time, in part maybe because they were pushed out of England for religious reasons, but also because they wanted to establish a pious society, what they called a city on a hill. They hoped that this would serve as an example to others. Now, Anne was not, if accounts are to be believed, she was not as enthusiastic about this move as maybe some other members of her family were. She didn't necessarily want to give up her life in England for what would be a rather rigorous and somewhat uncomfortable life here in America. But she did, and she and her husband, who were married until death, eventually would have 8 children between the years of 1633 and 1652. So if you do the math, 8 children in a period of about 19 years. Obviously, a lot of her time as an adult was spent either bearing children or raising children. It was a difficult life. It was a physically difficult life. It was a spiritually rigorous life. Again, you've learned about some of the perspectives and some of the practices of the Puritans, and the Bradstreets were no exception. They embraced this life of rigor, this life of hard work. And yet, despite the challenges of this life, despite the fact that she was raising 8 children, and despite the fact that her husband was often away on business, often traveling, she was still able to work at her writing. She was still able to produce some of the most remarkable poetry of this period. So let's talk briefly about her poetry. The book that she is known for is called The 10th Muse, Lately Sprung Up in America. And it was published in 1650. So when she was roughly not quite 40 years old at the time. And allegedly it was published without her knowledge, published in London by her brother-in-law, again, without her knowledge. There were numerous reasons for this. There were obstacles to a woman publishing her work. Even at the time, her brother-in-law had to sort of defend the work really on two fronts. There were those who would argue that, well, this couldn't be the work of a woman, so she must be plagiarizing, or this must be the work of a man. But then there were also those who would argue, well, a woman who is meant to be serving in the home, meant to be serving her husband and her children, has no business writing poetry. Nevertheless, despite these obstacles, the work, even on its publication, on its first publication, was met with considerable attention. It was met with considerable praise. It was heralded pretty quickly as a landmark achievement in poetry. And the poems that were included in this volume had been written over a 15-year period from 1635. So again, shortly after she and her family, just about 5 years after she and her family had moved to America, until about 1650, when she completed this volume. And the subject matter really demonstrates the fact that even demonstrates the fact that despite the fact that she was married, despite the fact that she had all of these constraints on her time, she drew inspiration from those things. A lot of the subject matter in this collection of poetry includes family matters, things like marriage and childbirth, as well as her religious faith, which was obviously important to her. And then, of course, her perspectives on what it meant to be a poet, especially a woman poet. We'll see that especially in the prologue. But throughout, you see references to her family, references to her marriage, references to what it means to be a mother and what it means to be a Christian, scattered throughout this work. And as I said, in the first edition, the publisher really laid out for readers that Bradstreet was well respected in the region where she lived, that while she may be a new voice in England, a new voice among the literary scene of England, she was someone whom was respected greatly in America, and again made clear that her poetry, the publisher felt that he had to make it clear that her poetry did not take away from her domestic duties, but she was able to do both. The fact that she was writing and publishing poetry did not mean she was neglecting her husband or her children. A 1678 edition was published after her death. It included Bradstreet's corrections, as well as some new poems. And it's really in this volume, the 1678 volume, the later volume, that we see her development as a poet. This work is deemed superior even to her earlier efforts, the revisions, the constant work she had been doing to update the poems, and the new ones she included really do establish her as one of the most important early American poets, whether we're talking about men or women. Now I want to turn briefly just to talk about a couple of the poems, really not to read them line for line or anything, but just to highlight some of the things to be looking at as you're reading the poems. So the poems that were included in your Canvas reading include the prologue, as well as the author to her book, To My Dear and Loving Husband, and a letter to her husband absent upon public employment. And in the first couple of these, we definitely see Bradstreet really discussing, what it means to be a poet. And really the spirit here, I think, is not too different from what we've seen in some other women poets, Amelia Lanier and Sor, which is that we see a kind of tone of humility, right? A tone of modesty that she's conveying. She's talking about in the first stanza here of the prologue, to sing of wars, of captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun, for my mean pen are two superior things. Um, the idea of an epic, right? All these things she mentions: wars, captains, kings, cities, commonwealths. These are the work of epic poets. She's saying, I don't have the skill that they have. Nevertheless, she says, my obscure lines shall not dim the worth of the poets and historians who write these epic things. Nevertheless, I do have something to say. And throughout, she maintains this tone of modesty in the second stanza. Um, when my wondering eyes and envious heart, great Bardas' sugar lines do but read o'er. Fool, I do, I do grudge the muses did not part twixt him and me that overfluent store. A Bardas can do what a Bardas will, but simple I according to my skill. So she's writing to a poet, Guillaume de Dubartas, a poet of just briefly before her time, who she is saying is, far surpasses me. I wish I could have just a little bit of the surplus of his talent. Now, obviously, as we saw with Sir Juan and Amelia Lanier, this is kind of an affect. Not that Bradstreet wasn't a modest woman, but it's part of the voice of the poet here to say, here I'm just offering my humble gift. That you can I hope that you can enjoy it. She goes on to talk about the work of the Greeks, the work of the work of classical poets, and yet she says, um, let Greeks be Greeks and women what they are. Men have precedency and still excel. This is stanza 7. It is but vain unjustly to wage war. Men can do best, and women know it well. Preeminence in all, and each is yours. Yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. So essentially, what she's saying there is, look, men, in writing these poems, I'm not out to take any of your glory away. I'm not out to diminish what your talent might be. We all acknowledge that all the best poets are men. We all acknowledge that you are worthy of respect because of what you've created. But can we women have just a little bit of the glory that comes with writing poetry? Can we just have a little bit of the respect that comes with creating something? And then finally, she says, and oh, ye high flown quills that soar the skies, and ever with your praise still catch your praise. If e'er you deign these lowly lines your eyes, give time or parsley wreath, I ask no bays. This mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold but more to shine. So she says, if you ever do happen to read my poetry, don't bother giving me a laurel wreath the way you did the great poet laureates of old, the great classical poets, or the figures like Petrarch. I don't need a laurel wreath. Just give me parsley and thyme. Um, that's all, and I'll be content. And in fact, these words that I offer, this mean and unrefined ore, they'll just make your poetry look that much better. So don't begrudge me or my fellow women poets the right to publish our work. We won't take any honor away from you. We won't make you look bad. In fact, we'll just make you look even better. So there's a sort of irony at play here. There's a sort of a humor, but a modesty that she's employing, a tone of modesty to win over her audience. A couple other poems that we'll look at. The author to her book. This is clearly one that is inspired by her life as a mother. And yet it's also dealing with the theme that is near and dear to her heart of what it means to be a writer. So she is describing a process that really any artist might be familiar with, the act of releasing something you've created out into the world. And she is writing from her experience to compare it to what it means to be a mother, right? So she says, thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. So she's describing the initial process of publication here. She's saying it's as though I gave birth to a child, and my friends, because they believed in me, because they believed in the goodness of this child, took it from my side and sent it out into the world, exposed it to public view, even though, again, in her tone of modesty, maybe you weren't fit for public view. Maybe in your rags, you should not have been sent out into the streets. She says, at thy return, my blushing was not small. My rambling brat in print should mother call. I cast thee by as one unfit for light. Thy visage was so irksome in my sight. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runst more hobbling than is meet. In better dress to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. In this array amongst vulgars mayest thou roam. So here she's describing a process that many of you might be familiar with, especially those of you who are taking composition right now. It's the revision process. So the work was sent to the publishers. It comes back to her and she has to polish it up, right? Just like she would a child. She dresses it in better clothes. She washes its face. She stretches its joints out. She helps it. She helps this child slash book to walk more evenly and more gracefully, and then sends it out again. In this array amongst vulgars mayst thou roam. And then finally she sends. She spends the last few lines talking about the work of the critic. In critic's hands beware thou dost not come, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. If for thy father ask, say thou hadst none, and for thy mother she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. So critics will read you and they will ask, where did this come from? But take pity on me. I'm a poor woman writer who simply wanted to send this work out into the world. Now, when she says, "Ask if for thy father asks, say thou hadst none," she's not saying anything about her marriage there. She's simply saying that this is her own work. She gave birth to this work herself. The poetry that she has sent out into the world is from her mind, her imagination. So a poem that really talks about the writing process, something that was near to her heart, but also the life of a mother and the experience of a mother. And then finally, the last two poems that you read, To My Dear and Loving Husband and A Letter to Her Husband Absent Upon Public Employment, of course, speak to her life as a married woman. To My Dear and Loving Husband, I won't spend much time on that, except to just draw your attention to it. It uses biblical language. If ever two were one, then surely we. It uses language of exploration of the new world. Compare with me, ye women, if you can. I prize thy love more than whole mines of gold or all the riches that the East doth hold, right? This is imagery that would have been familiar with people living in the age of exploration. It's a love poem to her husband. As is the last one, A Letter to Her Husband Absent Upon Public Employment, which speaks not just of her love for her husband, but of missing him when she's gone. It's a sentiment to that I think maybe we all kind of understand if you've ever been separated from someone you care about, whether it's obviously it doesn't have to be a spouse, just someone you love. And this is what she gives voice to in this poem. My head, my heart, mine eyes, my life, nay more, my joy, my magazine of earthly store. If two be one, as surely thou and I, how stayest thou there while I at Ipswich lie? So if we're supposed to be one, how can we be separated in the way we are? So many steps, head from the heart to sever. If but a neck, soon should we be together. I like the earth this season mourn in black. My sun has gone so far in zodiac. Whom whilst I joyed, nor storms nor frost I felt, his warmth such frigid colds did cause to melt. So she's using seasonal imagery, astronomical imagery, also something that was very present in the minds of people living in the early modern period. My chilled limbs now numbed lie forlorn. Return, return, sweet soul or sun from Capricorn. In this dead time, alas, what can I more than view those fruits which through thy heat I bore? So I'm cold without you here. I need your warmth. I need us to be joined together again. We are one flesh, and yet we've been severed from one another because of your work, because of your business. Which sweet contentment yield me for a space, true living pictures of their father's face. Here she's talking about her children. What can I do except view those fruits which through thy heat I bore, meaning the offspring of our love. I look at their faces and in them I see you. I look at our children's faces and I'm given contentment knowing that I have a piece of you here with me. Oh, strange effect, now thou art southward gone. I weary grow the tedious day so long. But when thou northward to me shalt return, I wish my sun may never set, but burn within the cancer of my glowing breast, the welcome house of him, my dearest guest, wherever ever stay and go not thence, till nature's sad decree shall call thee hence. Flesh of thy flesh, bone of thy bone, I here, thou there, yet both but one. So this final couplet, of course, brings together language from the marriage ceremony, language from scripture, and joins it with her feelings about being separated from her husband. So throughout, just at this brief glance of her work, what we see is that Bradstreet is really engaging with the things that are important to her. This is what good poets do. The life that she knows, the life of being a writer, the life of being a mother, the life of being a wife. Of course, she's also engaging her religious faith. And as a whole, what this creates is a body of work that, while it was widely accepted or enthusiastically accepted in her time, then widely forgotten, we're really fortunate that her work has been rediscovered and continues to be celebrated, because she really is a remarkable poet of early modern America, a remarkable woman poet, and really just a remarkable poet of the early modern world. So thank you for your attention.